Good afternoon, and for those of you who were here in the morning, welcome back. Just to remind you, please close your cell phones and Blackberries, and because it interferes with the live webcast, and it also is annoying for the speakers, I think, to see people constantly fidgeting with their cell phones and Blackberries. Thank you. It gives me a very great pleasure to chair this meeting. This is, for us at the center, and for me especially, a very special occasion, because the book that was put together, and you all have a copy of it, if not, there are copies outside, was produced under the supervision of my very good friend and colleague, Philippa Strom, who was the director of the Center's Division of United States Studies from 2001 to 2008, and she is currently a senior scholar at the center. I mean, before she came, we really did not deal with the issues of, as I said to some of you this morning, minorities, especially and not especially the Muslim community in the United States. So the center was at the forefront of putting together a series of meetings and then publications about the Muslim community in this country. Her last work was the book that you see here, Governments and Muslim Communities in the West. She had a co-editor, which is Jonathan Lawrence. He's sitting to my left. And today, Flip is going to speak about the book, so is Jonathan, and Peter Mandeville, who is Associate Professor of Public and International Affairs and co-director at the Center for Global Studies at George Mason University, will make some comments. You have the biographies of our speakers, so I will be very brief and let them speak, let them talk about the book, and then we will take questions. Flip, as I said, is forgive me, Philippa Strom. I mean, we are so used to calling her Flip. Is a senior scholar at the Wilson Center, where, as I said, she was a director of the Center's Division of United States Studies. Prior to that, she taught political science and constitutional law at the City University of New York. She has published numerous books and articles on topics such as the U.S. Supreme Court, the American presidency, civil liberties, and women and politics. In 1994, she received the Hugh Gossett Award for Scholarly Writing about the U.S. Supreme Court, presented at the court by Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Her edited Wilson Center volumes include American Arabs and Political Participation, Muslims in the United States, Demography, Beliefs, Institutions, Muslim in the U.S., Influence and Innovation, and Legal Standard and the Interrogation of Prisoners in the War of Terror. Her co-editor is Jonathan Lawrence, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Boston College, and he's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he is currently a Transatlantic Academy Fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. He's the author, with Justin Weiss, of Integrating Islam, political and religious challenges in contemporary France. For those of you who were here this morning, you heard Jean-Pierre Filiu referring to the book and complimenting you a lot on your book. The first thing he asked me this morning when he walked in, he said, "Is Jonathan Lawrence here?" I said, "I hope so. We need him this afternoon." So we are all looking forward to reading that book after what he said. And Professor Lawrence has written numerous articles, including the International Crisis Group report on Islam and identity in Germany, an essay on Tariq Ramadan in Foreign Affairs, and the book chapter entitled Managing Transnational Islam, Muslims and the State of Western Europe. Now, Peter Mandevin is Associate Professor in the Department of Public and International Affairs and co-director of the Center for Global Studies at George Mason University. His most recent book is Global Political Islam, a broad overview of Islamist movement and global Muslim politics. Other books include Transnational Muslim Politics Reimagining the Ummah, a study of Muslim youth in the UK, and several co-edited volumes and anthologies, including Globalizing Religion, which is forthcoming in 2009, The Zen of International Relations, and Meaning and International Relations. We are delighted to have all three of them, and as you know, the book is Governments and Muslim Communities in the West, US, UK, France, and Germany, which touched upon UK, France, and Germany this morning. So this would be a continuation of our discussion, and we have each of our speakers, I think, will speak maybe for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. Shall we start with you?
Thank you so much, Haleh, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to say before I get into the content that Jonathan Lawrence was not only co-editor, but Jonathan was the co-organizer of the conference from which this came, and it wouldn't have happened without Jonathan. So we are really, really grateful to you, Jonathan. I'll tell you also that he had the worst case of flu I have ever seen for the 3 days of the conference, and he soldiered through nonetheless. It was really an impressive job. So we're delighted to see him here healthy. Basic information about how this conference came to be was that we did, as Haleh said, we did have a couple of conferences on Muslims in the United States. Initially just trying to get information together and out to Congress as well as to other people about who American Muslims are. From that came a conference that initially was meant to be about which Muslim thinkers, Islamic theorists in the United States are influential abroad. And it developed into a conference that covered not only that, but which Islamic theorists in the United States might become influential abroad. And one of the reasons for that was that the currently influential people are all men, but there is a lot of very interesting Islamic feminist thinking going on in the United States. As a result of those conferences, I was asked to be part of a Chicago Council on Global Affairs task force looking at how better to integrate American Muslims into policymaking here. And as part of that task force, I was asked to go to England and France to talk to government officials and Muslim leaders in those countries. Out of those conversations came a realization that Western nations uniformly are trying to deal with the question of how best government officials might communicate with new Muslim communities in their nations. Muslim communities, in turn, were very concerned about their relationship, their absence of relationship with government officials. And government officials were concerned not only about connecting for security reasons and policing reasons, but also so that they could identify Muslims who would be appropriate when, for example, government officials had to certify Muslim chaplains for the military or for prisons, or when governments had to give a stamp of approval to butchers for being halal, or when governments had to include prominent Muslims in symbolic events. So we saw that this was something that cut right across countries, and we decided to have a conference that would bring together relatively low-level officials, meaning town, village, city, province officials, rather than national-level officials, because we thought, frankly, that the national official levels were not doing as good a job of communicating with Muslim communities as they might, and that much more effective communication was going on the local levels, and Muslim leaders from those countries. So after a get-together dinner one night, the following day we had a workshop that was closed to the public. And we closed it to the public for the very good reason that we wanted to have full and free exchange of information. And the following day we had a public session. And that is what is in this volume is really kind of a nice complimentary word for it, this pamphlet that came out of those meetings. So I'm going to talk very briefly about what came out of the presentations by the Americans and the English, and Jonathan will cover the presentations by the French and Germans. Most of you already know, I'm sure, that there is no adequate count of Muslims in the United States, but the guesses go from 2.5 million to 6 million. So you got a real range here. I think that probably we're closer to the high end, but I'm not going to go into that. We can discuss that during the Q&A if you'd like. Certainly there are Muslims from over 90 countries in the United States. The largest concentration of American Muslims comes originally from South Asia, another concentration from the Middle East. There are now quite a few African Muslims in the United States, and probably 25 to 30% of Muslims in the United States are African Americans. So certainly Islam is not a new religion in the United States at all. For the most part, and I'm talking in very big generalities here, for the most part, there's a very high level of socioeconomic integration on the part of American Muslim communities, not as much political integration. And by high level of socioeconomic integration, I mean that the income of the average Muslim family in the United States, and this is an average, is estimated to be at least as high as the average non-Muslim family in the United States. The Muslim immigrants to the United States have a very high proportion of graduate degrees, and so are to be found among the professions. And of course, this is as people pointed out this morning, differentiates American Muslims to a great extent from Muslims in much of Western Europe. While there is some concentration of Muslims in the United States along the eastern and western seaboards, there's a spread of Muslims. There is no state in the United States, as far as I'm aware, where you cannot find some Muslims. So we've got this geographic spread, and that means that officials in many communities have to deal with the question of how to reach out to Muslim communities. One of the new elements of Islam in the United States is the existence of community-owned mosques. Unlike mosques elsewhere in the world where the Waqf has created a mosque or where a ruler has created a mosque or something of that kind, the American mosques have followed the community model of churches and then ultimately of synagogues in the United States, where people come together and create a mosque and therefore feel ownership of the mosque. And as a result, you will have a diversity of Muslims from whatever town, village, city it is, claiming ownership and insisting on having a voice in the running of a mosque. And so this has also increased the number of women who are involved in the leadership of mosques. Now, all is not rosy for Muslims in the United States, which I'm sure you all know. And among the issues that came up during the conference were things such as racial profiling. Some of you perhaps know that before 9/11, those of us who consider ourselves civil libertarians would talk about the crime of driving while black and the fact that you were much more likely to be stopped by police if you were driving a car and you were African American than if you were white. Well, the Muslim community discovered that there was a similar crime and that Muslims were being profiled racially. And so one of the questions becomes, how do you avoid this?
You have to go to second inspection when you enter the United States.
Right. Well, wherever, whether it's the airports, whether it's on the roads, wherever it is, there is that problem. So that was one problem. Another problem was portrayal of Muslims in the media. Those of you who are familiar with the television program 24 understand the problem all too well. So that the image of the Muslim in the United States tends to be the image of a terrorist for the popular mind, and the question of what to do about that, how to overcome that media perception and portrayal. Islamophobia in the political sphere, and this has to do with major politicians, and Hillary Clinton among them, returning money that was contributed to campaigns because the money was tainted by coming from Muslims. So while there's been a high level of integration in, as I said, socioeconomically, certainly there are many, many problems that are perceived. And a major problem, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment, is accommodation of religious practices. How do we organize our workplaces and our schools so that Muslim prayer times can be recognized, so that the particular needs, perhaps, of Ramadan can be recognized? This is a major problem and a concern of the people who spoke at the conference. Now, there's a very mixed history of national and local efforts in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security has been in the forefront of reaching out to Muslim communities. As one of the officials in DHS said to me, we're in charge of relations with Muslims, as if it's only DHS and Muslims, and that's kind of it. And whether or not that being in charge and that outreach effort has been successful is certainly a matter of some contention. But because of the history of federalism and localism in the United States, local officials have, for the most part, done a much, much better job of this kind of outreach. And one of the pieces that you'll find in this little pamphlet is by Mayor Sue Greenwald, the mayor of Davis, California, which could almost be a how-to list of what you do in a community to make it welcoming to Muslims, particularly Muslim immigrants, and how to get your community thinking in terms not only of integrating Muslims, but of changing the community so that it becomes friendly to all people. Interestingly enough, in many places, the local FBI offices have worked very well with Muslim communities, while the effort at the national level is perhaps a little bit spotty. And Mayor Greenwald spoke about things like having interreligious gatherings, the government organizing visits to places of worship, having police ombudsmen who take complaints and do outreach to local communities, and so on. Now, the police thing is going to be a bridge to get into a discussion of Muslim communities in the UK, because one of the things that we heard at the conference that was really very interesting came from the police officer who's in charge of race and diversity in the City of London Police, and who wrote, or commissioned, I guess he helped write, a manual for police about Islam. Just to add to the knowledge that was out there, the manual is not only used by the City of London Police, it is being used not only throughout the UK, it's being used in many places of Europe, and certainly is the kind of effort that could be emulated here. But what was also interesting about this presentation, and again, this is in the pamphlet, was the very conscious effort of security and police organizations in the UK to involve Muslims in their organizations, including organizing police stations so as to have prayer time, so as to have prayer places, so as to reorganize the sinks in the bathrooms for easier foot washing. In other words, a concerted effort to get Muslims inside the security apparatus. Now, again, many of you will know that in the UK there are approximately 1,600,000 to 2 million immigrants, Muslim immigrants, perhaps 500,000 from Pakistan, perhaps 300,000 from Bangladesh. So obviously the majority are from South Asia. 50% of them are 30 years or younger. So you're really talking about a young population with a relatively low income, some professionals, but lower incomes than certainly the equivalent communities in the United States, and estimated 10% of the population in prison, which certainly reflects a class issue. Perhaps 65% of the Muslims in England are not in the paid labor market, which is also quite a difference from the United States. Demographic concentration is also different. There are perhaps half of the UK's Muslims located in 5 areas within London. So the knowledge about Muslims is quite different in large cities than in the smaller places in the UK. And the big issues are not dissimilar, but in socioeconomic terms they are dissimilar from the United States. There's a very big issue of access to education. There's a very big issue of access to health care. There are no jobs for educated Muslims in many of their hometowns. And there is serious discrimination in housing and in the job market. So again, a rather different picture. Now, unlike the United States, the government in the UK has encouraged the creation of overall Muslim organizations. And those of you who are from other countries in Europe will recognize this as a trend there. Of course, in the United States, given our First Amendment and the insistent separation of religion and state, the American government cannot do a similar thing here. But organizations like the Muslim Society of Britain, the Britain Muslim Forum, have brought together some Muslims who are able to communicate with the government, including the national government. And in November of 2005, there was a project called Preventing Extremism Together, in which government officials went around the UK listening to groups and then organizing reforms on the basis of what they heard. How successful that was is also a very big question. What we heard was that the young people in England are very angry. The young Muslim people in England are very angry, but they're very willing to engage. They're angry at this perception of the reality, I suppose, of discrimination and of lack of access to jobs and to opportunity generally. But there's also a big generation gap within the Muslim community, and that was typified by the fact that 80% of the imams in England do not speak English. And the young people are very naturally saying, how are we supposed to listen to you when you can't even speak our language? Again, in the pamphlet, you will see a presentation by Sajid Ahmadi, who now runs an organization called Birmingham Citizens, which is an NGO in Birmingham that not only brings together all religious groups for mutual understanding, but goes out and does community grassroots organizing as a group, as a mechanism for understanding. And she helped raise the question not only of what is the role of NGOs in helping to integrate Muslims and helping to create a bond with, or some kind of tie with governmental entities, but the overall question with which I'll leave you, which was something that came out of this morning's sessions as well: how do government officials identify and connect with Muslims who are not regularly involved in the mosques and who are not regularly involved in these overall national organizations? How do they simply know where the Muslims are, and how do they go about speaking with them? Thank you very much. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Well, to pick up on Philippa's last very good point, I think that part of what we discovered in this conference, and which one can certainly observe in Europe firsthand, is that there's less of a mandate for reaching out to non-religious institutions. constitutionally speaking, legally speaking, there's a lot less clarity about what, in fact, government's role can be to broadly encourage Muslims to embrace the state, if not within this highly codified area of state-church interaction. And so, therefore, we had this focus on outreach to religious communities, and there's a certain sense to that, but there are also real limits to it. Its importance, I think, shouldn't be undermined in a sense because of its because of all that it cannot do, but rather acknowledge for I think the important integration work that it does do, and I'll try and get into a little bit into how I think that's happening. But I thought the conference was a great chance for different participants from both sides, if you like, from the community side and from the state side, to get together in a relatively private atmosphere and actually exchange views. And I saw one evening late at night, in the hotel lobby, sort of forbidden partners speaking to one another rather animatedly in neutral territory in a way that they couldn't have done in their home country. And so that in itself was quite satisfying. The broad framework, in terms of the general impression one gets, say, by opening a newspaper and scanning for articles about Islam in Europe, is, of course, one of failed integration. One gets the impression that there's a lot of conflict around basic issues.
Failed impression? Yeah? Really failed impression? I live in Germany, and we are not integrated. Yeah, it's not impression; it's reality. Yeah?
Yes. Well, I guess that's precisely what we're here to discuss, and. The image, of course, is one where mosques are come under the subject of moratoriums or referendums about the height of minarets or squabbles of this nature. But if we look, in fact, at the actual development of Islam as an organized religion amongst these potentially Muslim populations of Western Europe, which, by all sober estimates, number around 15 million total, we see a sort of gradual expansion of the number of mosques and prayer spaces. So even though it's been very hard to get this large mosque built in Cologne, for example, or in Milan, to take another example, you actually have on the local level a very pragmatic approach on the part of many mayors and local administrations to simply sit down with a number of local religious leaders and hammer out agreements, so that we've seen, for example, just in the last 5 years in France, the number of prayer spaces go from about 1,500 to about 2,000, in Italy from about 450 to about 750, in the UK from about 1,000 to about 1,500. But it's important to keep in mind, with all of these thousands of prayer spaces, that a really minute proportion of them, a fraction of them, could be seen as proper mosques, in a sense. That is to say, built specifically for the purpose of being a mosque. The vast majority of these structures are converted storefronts or basements or factories, and are adapted. And this is, of course, one of the points of contention. Another indication of a certain normalization or gradual integration of the religion into the existing state church structures, one could look to the adoption recently of a common textbook for religious class in 4 Bundesländer in Germany, where you arrived at a certain consensus about an actual curriculum in a national context where, as few as 4 years ago, there was no agreement on even the right of Muslim children to have the equal access to religious education on the same basis as their Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish counterparts. The French Council for the Muslim Faith recently held its 3rd round of elections, and while that is hardly a model of direct democracy, it does indicate a certain regularity and a certain determination on the part of authorities to routinize the observance of Islam in France. So you have things like the public facilities for the celebration of Eid. You have prefects and mayors and ministers regularly attending iftars. You have the facilitation of the Hajj and consumer protection associated with that, not only in France, also in Britain. And so there is, I think, a certain everyday routinization that is taking place and which is broadly seen a good sign. But these are limited to religious issues, right? These are infrastructural questions which have, if you like, pragmatic solutions. And I think it's important to distinguish that when officials sit down with these interlocutors whom they have spent 20 years trying to discern which ones are the appropriate ones to actually ask, when they sit down with them, they're not aiming to create an official religion, right? They're not aiming to create a French Islam, even though there's been a lot of talk of that. They are trying to guarantee that there is a basic infrastructure for those Muslims who want it, right? And they're not creating political representation. They're not trying to ghettoize or communitarize or choose your verb. They are trying to, again, routinize the observance of Islam so that, in fact, many young Muslims in particular do not have to cobble together their own, whether it's on the internet or at fairs by picking up audio tapes, this kind of thing. They're trying to make sure that there is a kind of mainstream offer. But there's a real sense that if you play this in too heavy-handed a manner and try to create something like an official religion, that it can only backfire, right, as it has done in many of the homeland contexts. And so I think that there's a real desire to meet these requirements for religious observance, to go right up to the edge of negotiating a kind of treaty with community leaders while restraining and really being quite strict about these restraints, restraining these discussions to matters of religious observance and religious infrastructure. So the conference volume explores some of these instances in their local contexts. We discussed the merits of national versus local arrangements for state Islam relations, the more religiously oriented ones versus the more security oriented forums and their gradual blending over time. The notion that you have to, in a sense, get involved with training imams. All national governments have now acknowledged this, who are familiar with the local context, local language, local mores, but at the same time, and Philippa alluded to it, to train local and national police and administrators to become more aware of their new local context, right? To become more familiar with the diversity in which they now find themselves. The issue of creating national consultations is, of course, one which has been extremely controversial. It is, in a sense, a bit of a catch-22 in that for about 20 years, in the first 20 years of the settlement of Muslim laborers and their descendants in Western Europe, the decision by governments was essentially to outsource the responsibility for religious infrastructure to the sending countries. That is to say, to really allow consular networks and the embassies to have a free hand. And this was in the mutual interest of the host states and the sending states who were interested in maintaining ties with the community, but also in avoiding the host states becoming a kind of launching pad for dissidents or regime change at home. And they knew how to administer Muslim prayer spaces. They knew how to train imams. They knew how to provide chaplains and this sort of thing. And so the host states, which were themselves honestly a bit ambivalent about the presence to begin with, welcomed this outside help. At a certain point, this became viewed as counterproductive, as working against integration, right? So a lot of the well-intentioned multiculturalism, people speak of the era of Eurabia, etc., really ended by the late 1980s. That is to say, governments came to perceive the Muslim presence in their territories as a national issue and not so much one of international affairs any longer. Now, this has been a gradual process, and we're still really in a transition period. But we see the gradual domestication is too loaded a word, but the gradual nationalization of relations with the Muslim communities, so that one doesn't rely automatically on embassies anymore, although it's fair to say that there is still a really heavy reliance on these kind of pre-selected leaders who preach more or less an official Islam tied to the sending states, whether that be Algeria or Morocco or Turkey in particular. The catch-22, therefore, has been to expand this participation in consultation, to expand the number of interlocutors, the types of interlocutors, without discrediting the institution itself and without discrediting the interlocutors for collaborating with the state. And that is the delicate dance in which governments are now engaged, and community leaders as well. And this has been in large part about a kind of explicit search for so-called moderate Muslims, which is a difficult term, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine other groups accepting this as a kind of goal that we just have to find moderate Jews and then we can have a reasonable discussion, right? It sounds funny, but a lot of Muslim leaders have in turn reacted, I think, somewhat allergically to this, and I have some sympathy for that. One leader in Italy said, well, so what's a moderate Muslim anyway? Does that mean someone who prays 4 times a day? A French official once said to me, okay, so moderate Muslims must be those who don't plant bombs. I see. So why don't we just sit down with all of them and then we'll be able to have a reasonable discussion. Clearly, this definition has been elusive for many, but the notion that at least respect for the national legal framework and the national constitution forms a kind of baseline, I think, is gaining strength. But this is constantly accompanied by if you like, kind of social values, political values, frameworks that are then grafted onto these legal requirements. And this has had something of an alienating effect on many religious leaders who don't see why they should have to make all sorts of social and political values guarantees, whereas other religious leaders are kind of let off the hook on this topic. So in the conference proceedings, a lot of what came out was this how to avoid self-segregation, both from a kind of inner impulse within the community, as well as a kind of reaction to what are perceived as discriminatory practices by the state. And I think a real consensus emerged, and this was not from a monolithic group, but a real consensus emerged that that engagement is extremely important, that talking to one another is extremely important. This isn't a terribly surprising conclusion, but the experience of local consultations in particular, we discussed the experience of the regional councils for the Muslim faith in France, had this kind of practical utility where, again, on an everyday level, you have cemeteries getting built, hajis being protected from consumer fraud, mosques being planned in a lot less conflictual way than you see at the national level, where really the drama of actors confronting one another on a national stage leads to a lot of grandstanding and not so much in the way of actual progress. So these consultations are portrayed, I think, in the volume as imperfect creatures, yet as also playing a somewhat indispensable role in providing a regular forum in which a diverse group of leaders can actually stop calling one another apostates and sit down and deal with, again, the very practical issues of religious observance, so that Islam can take on the status of a recognized faith community alongside the other major world religions' presence in Europe. And so I'll just conclude by saying that the good news is that we no longer have a situation of outsourcing in Western European countries, right? We are no longer essentially passing the buck when it comes to creating an Islamic infrastructure for those who want it, again, which may be as few as 10, 20, 30% of the population, but it should, I think everyone acknowledges, be there. And with this cessation of outsourcing, we have offices in various ministries now really engaged with secular Muslims, religious Muslims, various associations. But there's been a real hesitation to let go of the embassies, and that's because it's so darned useful. Right? It is a kind of, as a governance tool, still somewhat indispensable for what is, after all, still a population dominated by foreign national leaders who are not necessarily subjects or citizens of the countries in which they live. And so long as we're in this transition period, I think it's somewhat inevitable that there will be a foreign dimension to this discussion. But I'll stop there and let the rest come out in conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Peter, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm grateful to Philippa and Jonathan for the invitation to join you this afternoon and to participate in this panel. I'm not going to speak in any real detail about the current issues and status of Muslim communities in any of the countries under examination. Certainly, Jonathan and Philippa, in their overviews, have I think done a very nice job of identifying some of the sort of long-standing and abiding issues and tensions, particularly within the realm of policy that are at play here. Rather, I'm going to be looking more specifically at the question of Muslim-government relations and certain sort of trends in policy outreach and engagement that we've seen in recent years, really kind of confining myself to the last 5 years or so. I want to start by emphasizing, obviously, that I do very much welcome this new study that's come out and commend it particularly for, and I think we kind of caught a flavor of this in Philippa's introduction to it, the fact that in terms of the voices that are profiled here, this conference has really moved beyond the usual suspects. One does not open this study and find the usual sets of names that you would expect to find talking about Islam in France or Islam in the United States. This really is a nice set of slightly discrepant perspectives from what we usually get in terms of those who either claim to be representatives of these communities or those that one just kind of usually defaults to when seeking these perspectives. So I think this is particularly, useful in that regard. I would also want to, for those of you who follow these issues, mention an event that was held in London earlier this summer. Very similar, it sounds to me, in terms of how this particular conference was configured. This was sponsored by the Social Science Research Council here in the United States and its counterpart in the UK, the Economic and Social Research Council. And the title of the conference was Muslim Government Relations in the US, UK, Germany, and France, and it also brought together a wide range of representatives from Muslim community organizations, law enforcement, government ministries, and again, as Jonathan alluded to, you had the very interesting sort of counterintuitive conversations breaking out in the corridor between hardcore Muslim Brotherhood members and state security officials who swore that they would never meet with those people. They're canoodling, as it were, in the corner during coffee breaks. So interesting conversations that weren't really supposed to happen. And I think there's a rapporteur's report on that will come out a little later this year. I just have then a sort of kind of set of broad points that I want to raise around the whole question of government outreach and engagement with Muslim communities. And one is to raise the question of what is at stake in engaging and approaching these communities as Muslims. What is at stake in projecting Islam onto these communities? What is at stake in having religion be the lens through which these communities are rendered legible or visible to the instruments of policy making? To what extent is it helpful in trying to understand the the priorities, the agendas, the motivations of these communities by labeling them and reading them through the lens of Islam, and under what conditions does that emphasis on Islam and religion actually get in the way and obscure the fact that there are sometimes other dynamics at work that may sometimes find expression in religious discourse and by reference to Islam, but which don't necessarily flow primarily from religion. Second, and I think somewhat related, is the question of the impact of the securitization of Muslim communities. I think very nicely summarized in the Department of Homeland Security claim that we're in charge of outreach to Muslims. I mean, this kind of at one level should strike one as bizarre. DHS does not claim that it's in charge of managing relations with Buddhists or Zoroastrians. But it seems to be very important to DHS to manage relations with Muslims. And, in many ways, the reasons for that, I think, are somewhat obvious. Philippa responded with reference to the context of the United Kingdom to the Preventing Extremism Together, the PET initiative. Indeed, in recent years, much of the U.S. government's own funding for outreach to Muslim communities has flowed through a government department known as the Department for Communities and Local Government, DCLG, that has a faith unit that has largely been in charge of aggregating and coordinating those resources and kind of rendering them into programs and policy instruments. What's interesting is that this is meant to be, a policy space for engaging the Muslim community, but I would say that approximately 90 to 95% of the funding going through that program for outreach to the Muslim communities is primarily counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism, security-oriented funding. And this then creates obviously certain disparities and discrepancies in the conversation between Muslim communities and the government, described to me by my interlocutors in the UK kind of roughly as follows: that yes, we get that the government is worried about terrorism. We're worried about terrorism in the community as well. We also have problems with drugs, gangs, unemployment, and all the government wants to talk about is terrorism and radicalization. We're happy to deal with those issues, but we would like to have a wider conversation as well. So this question then about the extent to which the securitization and the almost exclusive emphasis in recent years on counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism, as the primary sort of policy programming that tends to be funded. I understand that this morning the question of the relevance and representativeness of some of the Muslim organizations came up as a key question. I think this is a very, very important point. The fact of the matter is that most Muslims in the UK, in the US, in Europe more broadly, do not understand their religious identity, do not engage Islam primarily through the auspices of national organizations, groups, and movements. They are generally not part of these groups and movements. And indeed, claims on the parts of some of these groups and movements to be representative of or to represent the views of these Muslims, I think, need to be treated with some skepticism. And indeed, this is something that I think the British government in particular had to learn the hard way when in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and then the July 2005 bombings, the Muslim Council of Britain, the MCB, became the sort of primary point of interlocution with the British Muslim community. Now, the MCB is, of course, a broad umbrella organization representing some 600 national, regional, and local Muslim organizations that run the gamut from sort of Pakistani-style madrasas in the forests and far provinces of deepest England to highly cosmopolitan, progressive Muslim professional groups in London and cities in the southeast, meaning that the range of views and understandings of Islam represented within that body is just so enormous that it would be almost impossible for such a group to be representative in any meaningful way. Further complicated by, I think, a number of unfortunate errors of judgment on the part of the leadership of those groups in terms of certain very public pronouncements and stances that they took, And the ongoing fact, and this has been alluded to, I think, at the end of Jonathan's comments when he talked about the persistence of a tendency of a certain generation to be present in these positions, the fact that within the Muslim Council of Britain, while it is a broad-based organization, the leadership positions in that organization, for the most part, have tended to be occupied by individuals associated with the legacy groups of the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood. And they have basically not really made space for a younger generation, which often has rather different priorities and different views to come into positions of senior leadership. And this is an ongoing issue, which leads to this point of kind of a shift that takes place around 2006, where the British government, to put it crudely, drops the MCB as its primary point of interlocution and begins to reach out to a wider range of groups, some of which are effectively the creatures of or the creations of the British government itself in its search for a quote-unquote moderate Islam, a very problematic concept, I think, as well, as Jonathan alluded to. And this created an emphasis that I think actually was a good move to make ultimately, because it involved dropping the dream of ever finding a national voice for Islam and to say, look, there is no such thing as a national representative body for this community. What we should be doing is going into particular localized settings, getting a sense of the problems and issues that those communities face, and focusing our funding and programming in some ways a much more scattershot and ad hoc way, but let's drop the idea that there is such a thing as a national Muslim representative body, and to drop the idea that it would be possible to have such a thing as a national policy towards Muslim communities, which then raises the question of, well, what range of actors do governments engage with? In recent years, there's been a professed tendency for this kind of fantasy of a moderate Islam, and this has, tended to involve an emphasis on reaching out to nice, cuddly Sufis and good Muslims, quietist, apolitical, those who are not engaged in discourses of socio-political transformation, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the problem is that many of those groups don't necessarily have a grounding in the community in terms of being viewed as groups that represent and speak for the needs and priorities of those communities, which leads me back to a claim that I personally, at least, still think that there is a role for some of the existing Muslim organizations, even those, and this is where I think kind of thinking creatively about outreach gets to be very important. Even some of those groups that have ties to the Islamist movements, or are the second and third generation legacy groups of Islamist movements. Because in the case of the UK, when contrasted with the United States, the fact of the matter remains that it is those affiliated traditionally with Islamist movements such as the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood that have the highest levels of education, that are more prominently found in professional spaces, have the organizational know-how to mount these kinds of outreach efforts. The problem then is more this issue of the stranglehold that a certain generation seems to have on those spaces. Last couple of points relate to the question that's been raised of religious education, one that I think is also very important. We know that radical groups tend to prey upon the relative lack of religious knowledge that you find on the part of recent converts or individuals who perhaps were born Muslim but who have not been actively engaged or have not been sort of observant Muslims younger in life, who kind of rediscover their Islamic identity as they get older, but have not really undergone a life socialization and acculturation. And it makes them, I think, prey to some of the stories and discourses that these radical groups circulate in the name of authentic religious knowledge. The fact of the matter being that an actual undergoing or having some course of religious knowledge that contextualizes the Quran, the Hadith, Islamic history, in some ways acts usefully as a form of vaccine against decontextualized radical discourses. And this is, I think, also where there's realm and a remit for some interesting interfaith initiatives. I would refer to one that's present in the United Kingdom at the Markfield Institute for Higher Education in Leicester, where they have an imam certificate course. What's interesting about what they're doing there is that the imam certificate course requires a 120-hour practicum, and that practicum involves pairing an imam with a Church of England pastor. And the two of them go around together as the pastor provides religious services in his parish. The idea being that, well, we both practice religion as a vocation. Yes, you're Christian, I'm Muslim, but at some level, the act of providing pastoral care shares much in common across our religious traditions. So let's kind of hang out together with each other as we do that. Finally, then, when it comes down to this question of engagement, and the note that I would want to conclude on is this question of the younger generation and the intergenerational differences that are particularly pronounced, I would say, in the European context, and the question of how it is that space can be facilitated for that younger generation to rise to positions of prominence within some of these organizations. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor to questions and comments. I'll just have a question and then we'll move on to Bassam. Okay. This younger generation that we have been hearing the whole day about, what do they want? Do they want to be integrated in a secular state? Don't they want to be integrated in a secular state? What do they really want? I mean, this has been puzzling to me.
I think that, for those who have been born in and grown up in a European context, in a European urban context, the very notion of integration is a bit patronizing to them, because they say, well, we are the products of our environment. Integrated into what exactly anyway? And when they formulate the question as such, there's usually a pause in the conversation as the national representative of Germany or France or whatever tries to think of a laundry list of things that make them French or German. And of course, in Germany, the big discussion around Leitkultur, this unfortunate expression, was actually posed to the future Chancellor, Merkel, who, when asked to define this guiding culture that would guide young Muslims into the German nation, came up with, football and beer.
It's not true. She quoted my work. She said, Bassam Tibi wrote the book. I'm the source of the term. And she quoted my book, and she explained exactly to me values of civil society. So you are not telling the truth.
Okay.
I've been exposed.
Okay, go ahead, please. That's it. Yeah, sure, of course.
So what these young people want, in a sense, obviously there may be some existential yearning about identity questions, but I think what they mostly want is a job and a nice place to live. And to the extent that they are more receptive then to sort of alternative ideologies or alternative offerings, it's because the only proselytizers coming into their neighborhood are perhaps religious ones, right? There aren't enough proselytizers of the state, if you like, reaching out to them, political parties reaching out to them and disabusing them of the notion that there is a persistent glass ceiling. And so this is, the kind of question of expectations, right, and disappointment with reality. And just to wrap up here, that if you look at the sort of riots in France and the absence of riots in Germany, one could draw a very optimistic conclusion, or one could say, well, the reason why Muslims in Germany didn't riot is because they don't feel relatively deprived because their expectations of their environment are so low.
I'll speak to the American example. Picture two different things. One is post 9/11, young Muslims born in the United States, feeling American, very American, of course, suddenly finding themselves identified by the society at large as Muslims. Many of them being relatively secular Muslims, saying, well, if the country is going to identify me primarily as a Muslim, I need to know more about what it is to be a Muslim. And so you find more young women than in the preceding generation wearing the hijab, saying, all right, you're going to treat me as a Muslim. I'm really going to express my identity overtly, visibly, as a Muslim. Okay, so hold that as one picture. Now picture something else. A college campus with fraternities and sororities. And picture young Muslim women saying, we're on a college campus. Hey, we want to do the college thing. We want to belong to a sorority. But we can't belong to the existing sororities. The existing sororities focus on booze and sex. We are not going to do that. And therefore, they go out and they create Muslim sororities on a number of campuses in the United States. Okay, that is their way of saying, I am an American. I want to be recognized as an American. I am an American Muslim. And I think we tend to hear in the United States people saying that we are creating an American Islam. And I would argue that there are American Islams, plural, being created in part by the younger generation who simply want to figure out for themselves, what does it mean to be an American Muslim? Do you want to?
I mean, I would second what Jonathan said about the primary goal or interest being, I want a job. I want to be secure. I want to be able to educate my children, the same sorts of goals and needs that most people would have. If you ask the average immigrant to this country what they're looking for, that's what they're looking for. When you go on then and start asking questions about religion, though, but you're Muslim, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of what I'm getting at when I push us on the question of, well, what's at stake in emphasizing Islam here? If you push an interlocutor Muslim in the UK into a position where they say, yes, I would like for it to be possible for the personal status provisions of Sharia to have status in British civil courts, that turns into, oh my God, they're trying to create a Sharia state in the UK, when in fact arguing for that position is simply no more than asking for a status similar to what Jewish Beth Din courts in the UK have had for several decades.
Okay. Bassam, you had the comment, you have a question? Take the mic.
I have three remarks, but if you allow me, I mean, I was not planning this, just to give any information, yeah? And then I move to my three remarks. I'll do my best to be brief. 1998, I published my book, Europa ohne Identität, Europe Without Identity, and the term Leitkultur, I coined it. Even the word does not exist in German. I coined the new word, and I mean by this guiding culture of a civil society. And I use the term European, Europäische Leitkultur. And a CDU politician, Mr. Merz, quoted me, and he was attacked in public, and Mrs. Merkel defended him, and she said, the notion is not Islamophobic. It comes from an enlightened Muslim, and she quoted my name and quoted the book, and she read the book. Mr. Merz did not read the book. He used the term Deutsche Leitkultur, German Leitkultur. She said, Mr. Tibi uses the term Leitkultur, and she said, literally in den Spiegel, Herr Tibi ist unser Orientierungsstern. Mr. Tibi is our source of our orientation. So it's not about football and so on. I mean, just there's a debate about this, and I have nothing to do with the CDU. I come from the left, and I was a member of the Social Democratic Party, and I was defamed that I have been, you see, this is the atmosphere of the debate, or what I called this morning moral bullets. Yeah, and I was defamed as I have sold my soul to Mrs. Merkel and to the CDU, and I have not done this. So okay, so just the information about this. Now the 3 points in substance. I mean, we are. I mean, the figure was 2000 was 15 million. Now it's above 20 millions. But
sorry, you've been stating these statistics all day and have provided not a single source for any of your numbers.
It is okay. We can talk about this later. But I mean, okay, okay. So the issue is, I mean, diversity. We talked this morning about diversity. This is, I mean, this community, if you call it community, it is characterized by such a great diversity. So, can there be one voice for this community, or at least for each country one voice for Islam in France, in Germany, or in Europe? Is this desirable, and is this feasible? Given the diversity, I just give you some facts. Yeah, you know, in the Islamic community in Germany, if you call it community, there are 2.5 million Turks and 1.5 from all over the world.
That's just not the data that any government source or any NGO gives. And repeating it won't make it true.
Okay, so I don't want to fight with you. Okay. I live in Germany. I speak German and I speak Arabic, etc. And okay. So, but let me finish these 3 points. Yeah. You know, there are 700,000 Alawis, Turkish Alawis in Germany, and the Zentralrat, which is Sunni institution, they said in public. I mean, this is not behind closed door. Said we do not consider these people as Muslims. Yeah? So I mean, you see this, but these people are the Alawi Muslims, and this is the Zentralrat, the Islam Rat. The Zentralrat had two lawsuits, and they lost because they claimed if you are accepted as a Religionsgemeinschaft, a religious community, according to the German Constitution, Article number 7, you are entitled to collect Kirchensteuer. This is religious tax, yeah. And this is what is all about. And they lost the suit case, the lawsuit case, and then they tried it different ways. And the German Mr. Schäuble refused. He asked a social scientific institute in Hamburg to do a research, and they found they represent the foremost 10%. Yeah? So if you have only 10%, how can you represent them? And last year they established all four councils. They established Koordinationsrat der Muslime, the Coordination Council for Muslims, and they say we represent now Islam, and the government is not accepting this. Yeah? But now what's happening is diversity. Diversity is ignored. I mean, and I think Muslims should be accepted as diverse people. I mean, they are diverse. Even if they are in communities, you can speak about Alawi community, some Sunni communities, Turkish or whatever. So, but this great diversity has to be accepted, and therefore the homogenization of the Islamic community in Europe is a service to the Islamists. Yeah? And number two, and I'll be shorter, several countries intervene in our business. We are Muslims in Europe, and the business is between us, the states, and the European states, European societies. But why Saudi Arabia is entitled to intervene in our business? Why Turkey has the right to intervene via the DNet? This is very counterproductive. And the last point is, this is not marginal takfiri pockets. This is Rabita al-Islamiyya, and it's a document issued in Cairo that the measure offered for Islam in Europe is to make Muslims in Europe live according to the rule of Sharia. I think there are no statistics about this, but most Muslims that I know, they do not want to live the Sharia. We want to live according to European laws, and this is an intervention. This is transnational Islam, yeah? I mean, transnational Islam, represented by Rabita al-Islamiyya. This is not our concern, yeah. These issues have to be recognized. So we are not talking about formalities, about states, organized groups. The issue is much more complex than this.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. It's coming right.
Onur Sazak with Hudson Institute. I would like to thank the panel for excellent presentation. My question is a follow-up on Dr. Tibi's point, and Mr. Lawrence, you mentioned that recently the outsourcing the issues to other countries is decreasing, and the governments are trying to solve the issues within themselves. But to follow up on Dr. Tibi's point, what can the European governments do when the Turkish leader, Prime Minister Erdogan, goes to Cologne and in front of Chancellor Merkel tells the Turkish Germans not to assimilate, but to integrate. Please correct me if I'm misphrasing. So that's my question. What do we do when the governments take the matters into their own hands and intervene directly?
Well, these are, I mean, both of these questions, I think, are related. I mean, there are a number of legal questions that haven't been resolved yet because we are at the dawn of the Muslim presence in Western Europe. We are really at the beginning of a historical shift, and for the polity to be expanded, for the institutions to adapt to the new needs, is going to take time. We're not going to resolve this in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. This is going to be really a long-term process, and governments have only been taking this seriously for about 10 or 15 years. And if you look at any similar historical process, it's taken generations. On this issue of whom to engage, and specifically of the kind of possessiveness of various sending states. I mean, we've seen it as well with Mexican presidents coming up to the United States and treating Mexicans as their subjects. And obviously the Moroccan king has a certain proprietary sense of Moroccans abroad. You can look at the council created expressly for that purpose, and the Turks are especially active. The problem here is that host states, for the moment, haven't resolved their own legal issues in order to be able to offer a credible alternative, so that when imams are needed for the month of Ramadan, take a look at the seminaries that are active in a given Western European country. Right? You have a handful of graduates, and most of whom can't find a job, or if they did, they wouldn't take it because the salary is so low. And so naturally, the market for an imported imam is simply much better. And frankly, the training institutions that exist, whether it's through these Imam Hatip lycées in Turkey or whether it's through any of the major seminaries in North Africa or Egypt, you have basically a ready-made legally sort of a law-abiding imam whom you can bring in for a short-term purpose. So just now in the month of Ramadan, you had 175 or so imams flown in from Morocco and distributed around the continent because there's no local offer. But that doesn't need to remain the case, and indeed what this conference volume is exploring is precisely how do we get out of this this situation where European governments are so dependent upon importing. Just a note on diversity and whether or not these European governments are somehow privileging, a sort of a single interpretation of Islam. The creation of these Islam councils, really across the board, in the last 10 years, has been precisely the diversification of official interlocutors. So whereas you used to have a monopoly granted to basically one federation, now you have multiple interlocutors. And the result of that, no surprise here, is a deadlock, right? Because you have all these conflicting voices at the table, and so you could point to these national councils and say they don't work very well, but you can't point to them and say they're not diverse. Indeed, they're too diverse to function in many ways. And there's room on each of them, not only for the largest associations of prayer spaces or the largest mosques, but also in every case for what are called qualified personalities or expert individuals on each of these councils. So you have, in addition to the 5 grand mosque leaders and the 5 federation leaders, you have 5 or 6 who are there on an individual basis, right? Because the interior minister likes them. And they represent, if anything, a kind of secular Islam, however paradoxical that phrase is, because they are there for their views on the place of religion in society. They are there to represent the views of minorities within Islam. And this great mixture of personalities has made it very difficult, as you can imagine, to agree on things like curriculum or appointments of chaplains, etc.
Briefly on the issue of transnational Islam, I don't think it's simply a situation in which all manner of malignant international Muslim voices sort of seek to penetrate and coordinate and choreograph the activities, beliefs, and practices of Muslims in Europe. Indeed, European governments themselves have actively sought the interlocution of these groups at times. The French government turned to Sheikh Tantawi in Egypt looking for a fatwa on the headscarf legislation. Likewise, the British government recently facilitated the entry into the United Kingdom and the setting up of a branch of Al-Azhar in London with the hope that that institution might be able to pluralize somewhat the nature of religious education in the UK.
Yes, please, and then here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Jonathan Geyer with the National Democratic Institute. I'm from Michigan, which has a very vibrant Muslim community and very diverse, to add to what we've been discussing. And I can't speak to security issues, but in terms of political participation, there's a wide range of activity from all aspects of the community. How can we share these kind of lessons to our European counterparts?
Flip, you take it.
I think the lessons may go in two directions, you know. I mean, there are things that we do here that I think are laudable and that come out of a society that is used to being, this morning this term was put into disrepute, but a multicultural society in many ways, a society that for a long time has been welcoming to immigrants, even though we tend to treat every wave of immigrants very badly when they first get here, but ultimately we integrate them as they integrate us. But, you know, you look at what has happened, particularly to the treatment of Muslims in the United States since 9/11, and perhaps we have lessons to be learned from elsewhere. Or as I suggested, you look at what the City of London police are doing, and we have a lesson there. One of the things that was mentioned at our conference by Sajid Ahmadni was the surprise of American security officials who were taking Cat Stevens back to England after he had been denied entry to the United States, when British security officials came to the plane to meet him, and one of them was wearing a Sikh turban. And the American security officials were like, oh, what is this? And the Brits were, well, you know, this is one of our officers, sure. Well, in the United States, you're not allowed, as a policeman or a policewoman, you're not allowed to wear religious symbols on your head. I mean, so, you know, I think the lessons may well go both ways.
You want to add something?
I would just add that the State Department program, this International Leadership Visitors Program, has now brought through, I think, hundreds of European Muslim leaders, association activists through sort of 3-week tours of the United States, and has had, I think, a really interesting multiplying effect. Not because obviously all this has to be done with a very light hand, because the possibility of, you know, giving the impression that you're trying to kind of impose your model or impose your message on others is a very sensitive area. So I think in part getting those in the position to be community organizers, just to get to know the American context and how we do it here. I mean, it's very hard to reduce the success that Americans have had in managing diversity to a formula, and it is often something that has to be experienced firsthand. And so I think bringing people through is actually a great way to do it. And those participants I've met on the European side have all had their view of the United States highly nuanced as a result.
Yeah.
Afshin, did you want to add something to it?
Yes, it's very interesting. Thank you for your presentation. It's true. The question, let I say, the Muslim or Islam question project is in Europe, actually in the United States, also in the United States, a security project. It's not interesting the politician of the Muslims have a good life or a bad life. It's a security question. If the Muslims have a bad life, it's bad for counter-terrorism strategy. That's the point. But and the reality is very tragic. United States at this moment is not the United States as a goal for terrorists, but Europe. Europe is in danger, not the United States at this moment. 42 complots, 42 attempts to attacks are dissolved in Europe. And that's the tragedy. United States take the measure of regulation, Patriot Act, so very, very strong law, and the terrorists chose for Europe, for England, Spain, Holland, Germany. At this moment, the terrorism level code of Holland is higher than the United States. It's substantial. It's higher, and I think that's the reason of the complexity for many of governments in Europe, because it's so unlogical to take care about religious activity of people. It is we had this separation of religious activity of people. We have never asked a Dutch politician, have we good enough priest, Catholic priest? No, that was not the issue. Never. But at this moment is the issue, have we enough imams? They can speak Dutch. It's so unlogical, historically unbelievable, that we asked the people, the community, do you have enough imams that could speak Dutch? We have never asked the Catholic community, we have never asked the Jewish community, we have never asked the Protestant community, but there's a security reason. We want to know how many imams. Never in the history of modern history of the Netherlands or French or England, so many intelligence, people of intelligence service are active in the area of Islam. They know everything, literally, they know everything. And tragic, it's tragic because I think it's necessary. It's very dangerous if they don't know everything about activity in the mosque. It's so dangerous for our political stability.
Yes.
I'd just like to amend one thing that you said when you said that the focus is the security issue and not really anything else. I think that after 9/11 in the United States, and I'm speaking only about the United States, not about Europe here, it's true, all of a sudden people discovered Muslims.
Yeah,
and certainly at the national level, I think what you say is right. I think it's not correct at the local level, and that's exactly why we were looking for local officials.
I have about the national, not local.
Okay, but because the local thing, I think it's really necessary to distinguish. I mean, historically in the United States, each immigrant group has managed to get its desires met by virtue of getting involved in the political process, and that's not a route that, by and large, the Muslim community in the United States has taken, with the exception of African American Muslims. And so suddenly this awareness hit. And if you look at what mayors and town councils and so on in the United States are doing now, they're really not terribly concerned about security. They'll take money from the Department of Homeland Security for security purposes because that's the only way they can get the various police equipment and so on that they want. They don't really think that they have a terrorist threat in their communities. But they are suddenly aware of the Muslims as they were not because of this lack of Muslim involvement, relative lack of Muslim involvement in the political process. And all of a sudden they are saying, yes, these are people in our community, and we do need to be aware of them and their needs and reach out as well. So you really have to differentiate.
That's true, what you say. It's true. We have in Europe also government, local government, they need money for rebuilding, for police department, and they call, we have a terrorist problem. If the scientific people, scholars, or national government research and then say no terrorist problem, but economical problem. But after 9/11, before 9/11, we had only integration discussion about all of migrants. Not only about Muslims, about all of migrants. But after 9/11, is namely discussion is transfer only to the Muslims. All the group from Suriname, from Antilles, from other African or Latin America is not issue, but only the Muslims. And security is a very, very important and very, very dangerous question in Europe. Europe is target for Al-Qaeda, for many, many frustrated, angry young Muslims. And it's very, very dangerous. If they attack city, it's dangerous for political balance and stability. And that's the reason that many Democrats, many liberal politicians said, okay, take a strong law, take a strong measure if it's necessary to stop the attack.
Okay, I'm going to take two short last questions. Yes, please, and then Asima.
I will try to be as brief as possible. It Akira of University of Maryland. Maybe it's going to be a comment or remark.
Yeah, but very brief, please, because we have run out of time.
There is a problem in sociology, social construction of reality or self-fulfilling prophecy, that if we frame a particular group as Muslim or anything else, they become to accept themselves. This is a typical case in Bosnia. Before the war in 1990s, Bosnian Muslims didn't consider themselves as with very strong Muslim identity, and only the war began, and Bosnia was divided between Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Horatians, and Bosnian Muslims. Only at that time, Muslims in Bosnia started to reinforce their Muslim identity. And it might be the problem if we discuss mainly difficulties of integrating of Muslims in Europe, in Netherlands, Germany, or France. So what kind of solutions, policy actions we can propose? And if you have a successful story about integration of Muslims in Europe, typical case is Bulgaria, which has a 10% Muslim minority, and nevertheless in the last 18 years there was no any kind of tensions between ethnic Bulgarian majority and Turkish Muslim minority.
Thank you. Okay, the last comment from the panel. Jonathan, let's start with you, please.
I feel that I've been able to say my...
Thank you so much.
Can I add to his question? Because my point actually is similar to his. Would that be possible? We
just have run out of time, if you don't mind. It's 4:30. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the panelists. And don't forget to pick up